Welcome back. We've just tweaked ACSS default typography settings. So in this lesson, let's tweak the spacing defaults. A reminder, I want default sections to have a bit less top and bottom padding, and I also want to put some space between elements because there isn't any at all at the moment. Do we need to add margin bottom to H1s and H2s, etc. somewhere, or something else? You'll see. Before we spend the rest of the lesson tweaking the spacing settings in here, I recommend you first come down into Options and turn on Fix Paragraph and Heading Spacing. This just controls the space between paragraphs and headings in two specific places. One, inside rich text elements, you might add in the Bricks editor, and two, inside any Gutenberg content that you create in the standard WordPress content editor. I like these defaults as they are, but you can tweak them anytime. So you might decide later you want headings to have a bigger top margin when they're inside rich text and Gutenberg content. Just make this bigger here, but definitely turn this feature on. All right, I'll save that change. And with that done, now we can come to the spacing settings here. As with typography, we first set the base amount of spacing. Spacing means margins, padding, gaps. And this base amount of spacing is where all other margins, paddings, and gaps are calculated from. What this means in practice, when you use a medium space class or a medium margin class or a medium padding class, it'll be the rem equivalent of 30 pixels on desktop and 24 pixels on the smaller screens. And then basically somewhere in between for all the in-between screen sizes. And then the desktop and mobile scales, like with typography, sets the scaling for all the other spacing t-shirt values like space small or space large. Personally, after a lot of experimentation, I do like the default scale settings, they're fine, but I do increase the base spacing. I prefer my standard grid column gaps, for example, to be 40 pixels, and then mobile still on 24. With those base values set, we can now come on to section spacing, which is what I want to reduce. So these settings here control the amount of padding inside sections. Now it's important to understand that these two base multipliers are for top and bottom padding only. We'll come on to left and right padding here in a second. So what this does is multiply your base spacing values by this number. So remember, I set 40 pixels up here because I wanted my default column gaps on desktop to be 40 pixels and for default spacing generally. So that means that my section top and bottom padding on desktop at the moment is going to be 4 times 40, 160 pixels. That's way too big for my liking. I wanted more like 80. Well, that's easy enough. I can just change this number. So if I drop it to 2, then section padding is going to be 2 times 40, 80. And I'll have mobile on 2 also. So that means default section top and bottom padding on mobile will be 2 times 24 pixels or 48 pixels. And then the side padding, that controls the left and right padding on sections. And that is more straightforward. I'm just going to set mine the same as the base spacing so it all looks consistent. Further down we have contextual spacing, content gap, container gap, and grid gap. These correspond to 3 ACSS classes with the same name. Now I'm going to skip content gap, come back to that soon. Container gap just controls the gap between multiple containers inside a section. If you had a nested section, for example, we can come and tweak that as well later on. I'm going to change this for now to space M or medium. Again, that'll put a gap between the containers, which is the same as our base spacing. Let's move on to grid gap. You've already seen ACSS has a class called grid gap, which, surprise, adds a gap into your grids. Well, here is where you tell ACSS how big you want that grid gap to be. This is a space medium variable, and medium space, as you know, means your base spacing value up at the top. So this means on desktop, grid gaps will be 40 pixels, and then on the smaller screens will be 24 pixels. You could change the grid gap variable here to something other than medium, of course, but I think it's best to just leave it at medium. It works great. Let's save these changes now, and then come back and give that a try on our page. And yeah, that now looks a lot better. Okay, this is looking good. The final task is to sort out the gap between the elements. Now you remember in the main course, in theme style, we set a certain bottom margin value on H1s, H2s, etc. And that is fine, but there is a downside of using bottom margin to control spacing, and that is the last element in the list has a bottom margin on it as well, but you usually don't want that because it adds too much spacing at the bottom of a section. So instead, with ACSS, it is encouraged to use a content gap class instead to add gaps between your content. And here in settings, you can see the default content gap is set to be space medium, which also translates to the base spacing. I think that's going to be too big, but let's try it. The content gap class uses flexbox to add row gap, and like all things with flex, you set flex on the parent container of the elements you want to affect. So that is this block here, this column. Let's come and add a class of content gap. I'll just start typing content. See, now we have space between each of the elements. So this class is actually setting flex row gap to add a gap between each element. But that's too big a gap for my liking. So let's come back to ACSS settings. Again, remember medium in this space variable here is the same as the base setting we set up at the top. If I'd set a much smaller base value, then of course medium would probably be fine. But I do like the base space settings as they are. So let's drop this content gap space variable one step down to small. Remember, it's all just t-shirt sizes, very easy. Save the change. Back to the page and refresh. And yeah, that's better. I do just want to make one small tweak here. This heading needs to be an H2 in terms of the structure of the page, but I want it to look like one size smaller. I want it to look like an H3. It's easy enough. We can just pop a class on it. Back to the cheat sheet here. You can see that ACSS has a class for every heading level. These are just like the looks like classes that we made in the main course. Each one is just H dash dash and then the heading number. So let's pop the H3 in. H dash dash. And it's this one, H3. And that's it. The H2 now looks like an H3. Let's have one last check. I'll preview this page. So desktop looks good. We might want to shift this text down a bit or even have it centered vertically, but we'll do that next lesson. But see how all the spacing looks good, the relative proportion of the typography looks good. We did need to tweak some of the spacing defaults a little bit, but after that, we have no need to touch those anymore. All we do is just drop elements on the page and it'll all be spaced automatically. Let's come to tablet. As you know, that's Control or Command B. Yep, tablet looks great also. All the relative sizes and spacing, they've shrunk down proportionally to each other a little bit. Mobile landscape. So this is now stacking to one column. Remember, we added that auto grid class here that's just done that for us automatically. Again, sizing and spacing is perfect. And mobile portrait. Yeah, this looks great. And that is how to tweak ACSS's default spacing to your liking. Like with typography, all you do, you set your base sizes for desktop and mobile, your preferred scaling for desktop and mobile, and then for top and bottom section padding, you simply choose what number your base values are going to be multiplied by. It is a bit of trial and error, but if you want to just grab my values that I prefer, then they're below the video. Next, now we've tweaked the default settings, let's now flesh out our page, where we'll use various ACSS classes. This is where things get good. I'll see you soon.